was just Hal. He always was looking forward to things, and he was always looking at what he could do.
That was Fran Finney, the widow of the great Hal Finney. Hal was a cypherpunk, a prolific coder, and an integral part of the history of Bitcoin, as well as a great advocate of internet privacy. Hal was the first person to contact Satoshi when he released the white paper. He was the first person to mine Bitcoin besides Satoshi. He was the recipient of the first Bitcoin transaction and made his famous first tweet about Bitcoin on Twitter on the 10th of January 2009 with the two simple words, running Bitcoin. This is the very first interview that Fran has done since Hal and Fran were featured in a 2014 Wired article. What happened to Hal, Fran, and their family after this led them to leave the spotlight entirely, which Fran explains near the end of this interview. I also want to ask that people please don't try to contact them and respect the wishes of the family for privacy. They don't monitor social media or respond to messages. This was a absolutely wonderful interview, and I was honored that Fran agreed to speak with me in the Bitcoin community. And we are doing this to help raise money for ALS research in Hal's memory, which you can find at didyouknowcrypto.com/Hal. That's HAL, didyouknowcrypto.com/Hal. Thanks for listening. Fran, welcome to the show.
Hi.
So actually, before we get into the actual details in the stories about Hal, I wanted to thank you so much for sharing with me in the Bitcoin community your memories of Hal. He's a man who's very much greatly admired, and he's loved and appreciated in the Bitcoin community.
Thank you so much, Dustin. I'm really happy to share some of my memories of Hal. Hal was my life. Hal's a big chunk of my life. He'll always be. And I also feel really lucky to have been able to share that part of my life with him.
And before, actually, one last thing, just I want to do this right at the top of the show, is I want to let people know that every year you do a charity ride in Hal's memory to raise money for the ALS, but specifically the Golden West chapter that took care of Hal. And this is every May. And I was wondering, or I was going to ask everybody who's listening, if you could go to didyouknowcrypto.com/Hal, that's HAL, or if you go on Twitter, the at Bitcoin for ALS, that's the number 4. Or if you just Google Hal's Pals ALS, you'll find the links to the donation page. And we're working on right now, you can donate with the debit or credit, but we're working on getting the ability to donate Bitcoin live as well.
I'm really excited about that. I think I work for the ALS Association, Golden West chapter, and this will be the first chapter in the ALS, which is part of the ALS Association, that will be able to accept Bitcoin. I think that's really cool, cool, shall I say, and I'm so happy. This specific chapter, that's our local chapter, and the chapter did an awful lot to help when Hal was still alive, and I decided after he passed, they asked if I would be interested in working with them and for them, and I'm really happy to do that.
Why don't we start, all the way at the beginning? Where did you grow up? Where did Hal grow up, and how did you first meet?
Okay, well, although I spent my youth back on the East Coast in New Jersey and New York, and I don't know if I still have a little bit of an accent from that, but Hal was a California guy. He was born in California and spent most of his life in Southern California. We met at Caltech, the California Institute of Technology, where we were both undergrads. I was actually a couple of years ahead of him. I had started I was one of those people that was a little bit ahead. I'd skipped a year. So I'm only 1 year older than him, but I was a couple of years ahead of him. I met him as a junior. He was a freshman, and I was immediately impressed by him. He was just a really funny guy, an intelligent guy, and so we became friends. We didn't start seeing each other as more than that until after I graduated, but we were close friends during the 2 years that we shared together at Caltech, and then maintained that friendship, which turned into a lot more than friendship after that.
And what were you studying at the time?
I was studying biology. I was hoping to go to medical school, so I was pre-med. And I switched my focus, though. I went into grad school in neurobiology and then eventually physical therapy. So very medical. Hal started in math, and he switched because he was great in math. He came in to Caltech already testing out of the first 2 years of math at Caltech, which is unusual. So he was going right into the upper class courses, but he was fascinated by coding, and he switched to engineering. I don't think they had a computer science major back then, so I think his major was probably in engineering, but he was actually studying computers and coding. Uh, he just loved it.
I'd heard stories about how it was like to walk around campus with carry around like Atlas shrugged under his arm. I was just wondering, was he kind of a political person throughout his life, as far as for that being a very important part of his life, or was that just kind of just something more that because some people make that a very big part of their outlook, or was this just something more that kind of informed the direction of where he thought?
I think that anecdote of him walking around with Atlas Shrugged, that's a bit of an exaggeration. He was very much, he believed in freedom of choice for everyone, and politically, he wasn't an activist at all, but he was very happy to get involved in long discussions about that. Uh, Never a political activist, but had some strong beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, most of the it's kind of a more of a mixed bag, but definitely a lot of the early people and Bitcoining, and really the cypherpunks
Yeah.
in general, were very much kind of a libertarianish leaning, which was always very interesting to me because they were also a lot of them were California people, which is not necessarily the biggest hub of libertarianism in the country, but it was always very kind of just interesting that there was this whole group of people that were kind of brought together under this belief in the idea of a right to privacy, of a right to the ability to kind of choose your own path in life, and to kind of create a more open and free society.
Yeah, Hal was definitely that way. He identified as a libertarian, and he did many times register himself as a libertarian, although because of the way that the laws work in California, if you want to vote in a primary election, you have to be registered as a member of that party. So if you look through the history of Hal and elections, he would go back and forth from one party to the other, depending on who was running and what he felt he could have the most impact with, not even necessarily because he believed in or wanted or preferred the person running, but he felt in that particular election it would be more meaningful if he registered as a Republican or as a Democrat rather than a libertarian. Uh, but but yes, he identified very much with the libertarian cause. Not a perfect libertarian. He had some distinct issues that he taken might have disagreed with, but
Well, none of us are. There's the
yeah.
there's the trope in libertarianism is that there's you know we always like to accuse other people of, well, you're not a libertarian because you hold this one position that I disagree with, and there's only one real libertarian, and that's always you. Is usually how that
Right.
that works.
Sure.
Um, but so growing up in Southern California, did he do a lot of traveling throughout his life, or did he stick around kind of Southern California for most of his career and personal life?
I would say he wanted to do a lot of traveling, but things always came up. We didn't have a lot of money, so we did go travel a bit, but every time we traveled, it would use up a lot of our savings, and Hal really wanted to be able to pay for his children's college and not have to put them into debt. So we were always uh, very aware of the fact that we needed to maintain some savings so that we could do that for them. And so yeah, we did some traveling, but not much.
What was his favorite pastime? I mean, everybody's got their, I know that he was very much dedicated to his work and was passionate about coding and his family. But outside of that, did he have any specific hobbies that he liked to kind of engage in to kind of either take your mind off things or had a similar passion for?
He his hobbies were sort of eclectic. He had a lot of different things he liked to do. He liked to be outside. He liked to do things with the children outside, like hiking or going to fairs. And when he went to fairs, he liked to indulge and eat in all of the crazy food that they serve at fairs. He liked to go to parades with the kids. So family things big. He liked to go out and run. He liked to go out even when he wasn't into his fitness thing, he was going out and running. He liked to run with the dogs. He liked our dogs. He liked animals. He liked to read. He read all kinds of things, sci-fi big time. Uh, he liked to read technical books. He liked to do codes and puzzles. From the time he was a child, he was into secret codes. I have some of the things that his parents gave me of some secret codes that he was working on as a child, all written in little notebooks. Uh, Boy, I mean, you could. He tried to teach himself how to draw because he wanted to be a better artist. He he learned about cooking and tried cooking some gourmet foods. You name it, to pick an area, and Hal probably dabbled in it a bit. He just liked to do a lot of different things. I couldn't keep up with him. There's always one thing or another. Three
Was
things
very
at
much a
once.
Renaissance man then.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, you mentioned the running, and that was one of the things I was interested in because, um, uh, you said that he always liked to run, but later in his life he kind of really focused in and decided to pick up basically training for marathons, and you don't often see people just kind of decide to do that later in life. Usually, it's something that people do in their 20s and kind of that's their thing. But to decide at that point in his life, like I'm going to do a marathon, is kind of unique. I was just wondering what it was that drove him to decide just to pick that up, or was this just another one of those like, okay, I think I want to do that, so I'm just going to do that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually do have an answer to that. At some point in midlife, I don't remember exactly what year, might have been late 40s. He went for his annual checkup, and his doctor told him that he was obese and needed to lose weight. Hal had been, he was one of those guys that enjoyed life, always semi-active, but his weight had been gradually keep creeping up through the years. I think he had probably weighed about 170 when I married him, and it had gotten all the way up to maybe 240, 250. So it was gradually creeping up, but this was a shocker to him. So he tried dieting, and he did not like dieting. And then he was reading up on how to lose weight, and he realized that if he upped his exercise, that might mean that he wouldn't have to diet as much. So he started running a lot more regularly and a lot more, uh, increasing his mileage. And he noticed that that was really effective, and he was just dropping weight. So then he started becoming fascinated and challenging himself to run more. And I think that's what happened. It just gradually turned from running to lose weight into, gee, I wonder what would happen if I ran a half marathon. And then he ran a few half marathons, did well, and they thought, well, gee, I think I'd like to run Boston. And he had all these charts, mostly on his computer, but also written down. I have about 12 books all on running that he bought, because when he would get into something, I'm talking in the present because I still think of him so much and I dream about him. So I started hearing myself say, when he gets into something. But anyway, when he would get into something, he would always go for it in a big way. So I still have all of those running books: how to increase your running, how to run a marathon, how to win a marathon, how to do this, how to do that. And one of his bucket list ideas was that he wanted to compete in the Boston Marathon. But that all happened because of this shocker from the doctor that he was obese. His weight, though, for the last few years was down around 160. So he was actually leaner than he had been when I married him.
It sounds like he was a person that would find something interesting, and then once that kind of clicked for him, he just kind of became obsessed with it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Once it clicked, he became obsessed. He admitted that. He admitted that he would become obsessed with things sometimes to the point where he would realize, hey, I have to pull back a little bit. I'm just becoming too compulsive about this particular thing.
Well, and as far as for like his daily, because like with that kind of obsessive, personality of getting, did that spill over as far as for like his daily routine? Because it sounded like he was a pretty, I mean, was he a pretty regimented person in terms of like planning his day? Like he would have, as for example with the running, did he just decide to run whenever he got up, or was it like, okay, at 5:30 I'm getting up, I'm gonna start running for I'm gonna run for an hour and 15 minutes, and I get back, I do my breakfast, then that sort of thing? Or was it kind of more of an open schedule, and things get fit in as they become available?
I think it was more of the second, actually, Dustin. He did have schedules that he used sort of more as a goal, but Hal was very flexible. That was one of his I would say a big strength. He was amazingly flexible. Although he had goals that he wanted to pursue, he also was really fine with switching things around and pushing things over and rescheduling in order to still sort of meet those goals. And he was very successful with that. Maybe at least outwardly. I don't know inwardly if it was something that ever bothered him, but he didn't show it. If something came up with the family, he was very quick to move things around. Uh, the some of I would say he managed to fit more into a day than I could fit into multiple days. He just did things. He was always doing something. I rarely saw Hal not doing something. Wake up and the day is moving. Something comes up, he addresses it, and then he gets back to what he was doing before, or what he needed to do. But he was always telling me I needed to be more flexible, but in a nice way. He had a joke where he would say, Fran, put on your flexible cap, when he needed to make a change, because even though my days were much simpler and less demanding and had less in them, when there was a change in my plan, it was difficult for me. And Hal never gave me a hard time about it, but he would tease me about it. So he did have that little saying, Fran, when he needed to ask me to make a change in my plans, Fran, put on your flexible cap. But I would say Hal lived with his flexible cap on.
Would because I have this issue of my wife always says that I can't relax. That somewhat similar, although I'm not as prolific as Hal was, where I have a hard time having downtime. I don't like to, you know,
That's like Hal. Yep. He had a hard time with downtime.
where it was, yeah, it's you can't just sit and like, it has to be something that's planned where we go and watch a movie or whatever. I don't, and I was just wondering, is that something like if there was, at the end of the day the kids are in bed, it was, I imagine that he was, from what you're describing, is the type of person that wouldn't go, I'm just going to go watch TV for an hour and go to bed. It was more of a, well, I can be reading this, or I can be working on that, or planning, this running schedule.
Absolutely. No, the second. In fact, I always went to bed before he did because I just couldn't stay up. Sometimes I used to, well, if we were in the early days, he would be at work because back then you couldn't do your work from home. There were no home computers to do the coding that you wanted to. So he would want to be at work because he was working on something interesting, and I would be at work with him. This is APH, some of his early jobs. And so I would just bring a blanket and I would lie down on and near him and nap while he was at work. This was pre-kids too, but I was with him, spending the time with him. He wanted to do some more work, so I would be there. At home, once he had the ability to work from home, that wasn't an issue, and it was great that he could do that, and he could seem to survive on less sleep than I needed. Uh, I do have a little quirky background thing about him that might explain part of this, but it was something again that I admired. His family had a tendency towards drinking a lot, and Hal, when he was in college, he never drank in high school, but when he went to college, college life involves drinking, and he realized that drinking was a great way to relax. So he started drinking. Well, early on, he had some, and I don't know if this was a warning for the ALS or whatever, but he started having seizures, and we took him to the hospital trying to figure out, was it epilepsy, what was going on. They did some testing, and basically they told him he better not drink. So he stopped drinking. So for the rest of his life, and this was from, I guess, about a year into my marriage with him, he didn't drink. But he didn't have that way to relax. A lot of people will say, oh, I'll have a glass of wine at night and that'll help me wind down, and that wasn't an option for him. He took it very seriously. He didn't want to deal with that. I don't know if you could call him an alcoholic because it was sort of a pre-alcoholic thing, but he took it as I better not drink, so he didn't. So that outlet for him was gone.
Well, yeah, I think that that's very common for, people like Hal that are very, very driven, is that, things like alcohol is something that can help basically turn the mind off. Where without, um, sometimes they just want to basically shut all that off so they can relax, where without it, your mind's racing in a thousand different directions. And, but, it seems like, well, I mean, he took that very seriously, and then it just kind of, turned that drive into work and family, which is, a very, very healthy outlet. I was just looking at his, because I have a copy of two of the games that he worked on, Adventures of Tron and Armor Battle, that he did in '82 and '83. And which company was that? Because he programmed, I think it was 5 games, and then Tron he did completely by himself, if I'm not mistaken. But was APH that company, or
Yes,
was that a different
yes,
one?
that was
Okay.
APH. Which is I'm not even sure what APH stood for. At Caltech, APH was applied physics, and Glenn Hightower, who started the company, that was his major. But I don't even know if APH stood for that, or if it was just letters. I think it was just letters.
Yeah, I know it's you can actually there's a Easter egg that you can find in Adventures of Tron. I was looking up on I just happened to be going through it. It was a video game Easter egg thing where you can find like these little hidden things that programmers put in the games, and it was very much earlier on. Now it's more about like they put these little cheats in there so that you can do something in a game that you normally can't. But earlier on, it was like little messages and stuff. And there's a little Easter egg in Adventures of Tron where you can Hal's name shows up in the game as one of the Easter eggs that's in there. So it was kind of interesting. What was I mean? I know that you said that you don't or that we talked about before we start recording that you don't have a lot of knowledge of the technical stuff. But what was um, what would you say that is like favorite place that he worked at, and just as far as for the coding and all that. I didn't know if it was doing the video games or working with Phil, or where was this basically where he was really happy with what he was doing.
I think Hal, a couple of places, but he was definitely very happy working on PGP, both prior to being actually paid and reimbursed when he was doing it just out of interest with Phil, and then later on when he was working for PGP Corporation or Symantec. I think he liked that because it was something that he felt was important to work on. He enjoyed working for with Glenn at APH. But he felt like that was not challenging enough, and so and I think a lot of his other jobs he worked because and he enjoyed them, but they weren't challenging him enough. He worked at Amatech after APH, and because he felt he wanted to do some more real work, so he was working with parallel processors then. But he again didn't feel like that was broadening his knowledge enough. So then he went to work on compilers at Green Hills, and he liked that because he was learning new things, but he didn't feel challenged. He wasn't fascinated by it after a while, and that's when he started doing outside of work with Phil, uh, working on cryptography. Uh, so that was back in the middle 90s, I think, when he started that. So I would say, yeah, APH was fun. Everything else he liked because he liked the learning, and then PGP absolutely because it was something he felt was important. He started dabbling in crypto cash with his. I don't even remember RPOW. I don't know what any of that means, but anyway, started dabbling in that because Hal would always wanted to challenge himself. So yes, he was working on PGP, and then once that was his job, he started looking for something else that would be fascinating that he could challenge himself with. Always looking for more things.
Well, and I mentioned offline as well that when I interviewed Phil, a good chunk of the interview was actually we just kind of talked about Hal and his relationship with him, and I always thought that was really a really good example of his character, and that he was helping Phil with PGP, and Phil kind of he said that he kept his name out of it because they were still in dealing with the government case at the time, and he was just worried he didn't want Hal to have any kind of repercussions from whatever fallout. I mean, everything turned out fine, and rightfully so. But I was just thinking that really spoke to his character and who he was that this was all he was doing this because, or this is my assumption, was that that he saw PGP as being something that was right to do, and that people being able to protect their communications on the internet, from being eavesdropped on, was the right thing to do. And then he didn't do it for, he wasn't paid, and he wasn't doing it for fame or notoriety, because no one really knew about it until many, many, many years later. And even then, it's still not that well known that he was working on PGP during those years. But I thought that was, to me, very telling of who he was, in that he just kind of saw the right thing to do, and did it, and wasn't looking for people, for adulation.
Yeah, I think that that's a lot of it. That's a lot of it. And then the other was just that Hal loved mental challenges. He loved puzzles. So it was a combination of knowing and feeling very strongly that it was the right thing to do, and at the same time being really intrigued by it and really enjoying it and wanting to solve this puzzle. So both things, some altruistic and some just because he enjoyed it.
And everyone sees the world, in a different way, and their personal life experiences and their personality and who they are kind of almost kind of paints the windows that they look at the world with. And I was just kind of wondering what his outlook on life was, how he experienced it. And just, because from what I've heard, or I should say what I've read, and then from talking with you, it seems like he was a person that was just had a very positive outlook. Wasn't someone that would allow, adversity to really kind of change their his worldview, per se, on to color it and change who he was,
Oh
whereas he just
man,
kind of looked
that's
at.
absolutely true. Absolutely true. He was so positive. This was why he dealt with the ALS the way he did. He was positive his whole life. I could not. I feel, yeah, dwarfed by him. My family was not like it, but Hal wasn't. His family wasn't like that. That was just Hal. He always was looking forward to things, and he was always looking at what he could do and what he had rather than what he didn't have or what he might have lost. Or looking back, he didn't have regrets. He just always moved forward and looked at what can I do now. It was crazy actually, Dustin, because I'm not that way, but I learned so much from him, about being that way, about how to move on and look forward and see, look at what you have now and what can you do with it. And he was a very positive person. He wasn't just a glass half full. He was like a glass mostly full, even if a lot of stuff was lost.
And like you were talking about that, early on, I think that, that probably was, made for a very happy relationship, and that you said you guys didn't have a lot of money, and or, especially early on in a marriage. I think most marriages are like that, where live in a tiny apartment or tiny house, and then if you just keep on moving forward. And then, I mean, I imagine, that the biggest struggle he probably ever had was that diagnosis. How did that come to be? That, because I'm somewhat familiar with ALS, but I don't, know exactly the kind of genesis. How did he come to, realize that he needed to go and see somebody, and how did he, that diagnosis kind of affect how he was going to go forward with his life from that point on?
Yeah, ALS is a big umbrella diagnosis. Right now, it's not very well understood, and we do know that there are a large number of diseases or syndromes that would be considered ALS now. In fact, the diagnosis of ALS is what we call a diagnosis of exclusion, where you test for everything that we know more about, And when all of those things are ruled out, including, brain tumor, MS, a lot of neurodegenerative diseases, just many, many different things, lead poisoning, Lyme disease, many things. Then by, and it fits certain patterns, which are very specific, and I won't go into those, but then it's given the diagnosis. It can present in many, many different ways. In Hal's case, early in 2009, he started noticing his running training that he wasn't improving so much, that he was getting more tired. His times, he kept everything charted, and he was just tiring out sooner, and it felt like he was cramping up, or he couldn't push himself quite as much. So he started looking into different ways to run, like something called Zen running. Then I noticed when we used to run together, I noticed that when we would talk and run, he wasn't able to talk and run at the same time. I mentioned that to him, and he actually got a little bit short with me and said, "Well, no one can talk and run at the same time," which I thought was a crazy thing to say, but I think he was worried about it. And so he said that to me, and that was very uncharacteristic of him. And then he started noticing slurred speech, very mild. But the more he spoke, the more it happened. It almost sounded like he'd been drinking a little bit. So, speech, talking when running, coordination. Um, and this was still early in 2009. He started noticing a lot of different things, that his right hand felt a little uncoordinated, uh, but he could still type with it. We went in to see his first thing we did was it's a long progression just for the first few months, but we went through several doctors. He saw first a, I think, went to see a rheumatologist because I thought maybe it was a general rheumatological issue. Rheumatologist said, "Oh, you're just getting older." But then the speech issue became worse, and he went to see his primary doctor, who referred him to a neurologist. Once we saw a neurologist detected red flags, started testing him, and we didn't want to stop the testing, but I think his neurologist started suspecting that it might be ALS around May of 2009, and at that point referred him to a UCLA clinic that specialized in ALS. And they did more tests, and he got the diagnosis in August of 2009. So it was pretty quick onset for him from the initial things showing up maybe in February of 2009.
Yeah, and your background in pre-med, I imagine that was compared to someone that had no background in this sort of the field, that it was probably, I mean, helpful, but also somewhat of a burden, having that knowledge of medicine, and compared to just trusting the doctors. Especially that first one, it was just like, oh, it's probably just you getting older. But how did that kind of influence and also help through this time period of your life?
Yeah, I knew something was wrong. Hal, being the kind of person that moves on and moves forward, initially preferred to ignore all of these things. That response to me about his being able to run and talk at the same time, for example, I that was wrong. I knew that was wrong, but he just assumed that he had never noticed it before. He didn't want to focus on that. He wanted, when he was not able to run as well, he, instead of looking at why can't I run as well, he started looking into alternative ways to run so he could continue to run. Uh, so I would say, yeah, at that point it was a burden because I kept feeling like I was the monger of bad news. I was the person who kept saying, "Hal, you need to get tested. Hal, you need to go to the doctor." I didn't want to be right about something being wrong, and Hal wanted to just keep moving forward and figuring out ways to deal with each new problem as it cropped up. But he was willing to listen to me, and then it turned out it was something very terrible that couldn't be treated anyway. So that was frustrating. I mean, I was hoping by pushing him, saying, "You need to go to the doctor, you need to do this, you need to do that," that we would figure out what was wrong and we would fix it. But unfortunately, it wasn't fixable. So, yeah, that part was a burden. Later on, it was a great asset to have this background so I could keep him comfortable. I could see red flags about things that needed to be dealt with, so that he wouldn't get sick or get infections or get bed sores or whatever. There were just infinite numbers of things that you have to deal with as someone becomes paralyzed and are choosing to live at home. So I knew enough that that was helpful. Uh, so I would say that was only good. It was only good. It allowed me to keep him comfortable and alive and actually effective longer, because at some point he was no longer disabled. He was medically, uh, he was a medical person instead of a disabled person. Uh, and, and at that point, he was relying on other people to do everything for him. So then it was helpful. Prior to that, Hal wanted to figure out how to do things for himself, and he kept doing that for as long as he could.
Well, I imagine being the type of person that he is, and especially being a programmer, and within that mindset, and just who he was as a person, was that there's, if you find a bug in your code, you search for it, you find it, you fix it, and then you keep on moving forward. And having that diagnosis versus something else where there was a specific treatment or a diet regimen that would you know have an outlook of fixing it, would be quite difficult to deal with. I've a relative. It's not ALS, but she's had muscular dystrophy for quite a long time. That slowly progressed over time as far as for her ability to walk and function in a lot of ways. And I know that that's a very difficult thing to do, or to be able to wrap your head around. But I imagine that would be a little bit more with that mentality, like you said, of let's just move forward, where you're saying let's hold up and figure this out.
Brush aside the fact that he was losing the ability to do things the way he had done them before, and instead was looking into, well, how can I deal with the current situation? This is where I am now. So what do I do with it? And he was so proud of all of his little accomplishments. One of the frustrating things about a disease like ALS, though, a progressive disease, is that you figure out a fix, and then a week later, that fix doesn't work anymore. For some people, the progression is slower, but for Hal, it was an ongoing thing. Okay, now I can get out of the chair if I have a lift chair and I have a pole over here. Okay, now I can't do that anymore, but maybe if I have a lift chair and a pole and I figure out another way to put something else so I can grab with my other arm. Okay, well, now that doesn't work anymore. So maybe now if I have a lift chair and something that swivels, I mean, always figuring out what can I do? What can I do? Okay, now my hands don't work anymore. So how can I do it now? uh, Eventually, as I said, he needed to rely on people completely, but he was always looking with the coding. At first, he noticed his right hand wasn't working, so he taught himself to touch type with his left hand. And he was doing single hand, left handed, fast. He had been an amazingly fast coder. His typing speed was, I don't know, 120 words per minute when he was using both hands. Well, he taught himself to type very quickly using just his left hand. Then he couldn't type with his left hand anymore. So then he figured out how to put a little splint on some of his fingers so they would stay stiff enough so he could still type with two fingers with his left hand. Then he figured out how to type with one finger with his left hand. Then he couldn't do it anymore, so he figured out how to so then he got into eye gaze. Well, how can I do it with my eyes? He got a program called Dasher, which was an amazing way to go really fast with his eyes, but it required fine eye control. So he did that for a long time, probably was still doing that when he posted Bitcoin and Me. But towards the end, he started losing his ability to control his eyes. We saw several doctors about that because Hal knew he was losing the ability to control his eyes. But the doctors, it's so rare in ALS, they kept saying, oh, no, no, you just need new glasses. Oh, no, you just need to stop doing this. Oh, no, maybe it's your medication. Let's pull you off these medications. And we tried all of those things, and he continued to lose his ability to move his eyes. So we moved into communicating with one with screens that had just maybe 4 letters at a time on the screen that he had to scroll through very slow instead of his fast way, and that worked for a while, and then he lost that too. But until that happened, I would say Hal's focus was always, let's see, what can I do with what I have now? How can I work with this? As you said, coder mentality. Let's see how can I fix this bug? But instead of a bug, it's more like, this is what I got to work with now. He also came from an early time where he learned binary coding. He learned early, very, very primitive computer languages that didn't have much to work with. Memory was minimal. His games that he did back for PGP were, I don't know the correct numbers or anything, but minimal to work RAM to work with, and if that's right, I mean the I better stay out of using any technical terms because I'll misuse them. But anyway, he didn't have much to work with. It was very primitive, and he knew how to do that. So he kind of had to go back to doing that with communication for himself.
Well, I'd read an article, or actually no, I think it was in Bitcoin and Me. Yeah, I believe no, that was the post where he was talking about how he'd created an interface using an Arduino system so that he could adjust his wheelchair's position using the eye movement tracker, and it was
Oh
very
yeah, that was
very
so crazy.
yeah,
It was amazing. Totally.
he was just
He,
continuing to create things to better, just better his situation, looking for anything that he could fix.
And he had such an upbeat attitude about it, Dustin. I remember he was gleeful. He was gleeful about doing this. He was so happy to be able to do this. It was a serious issue. He'd been in his wheelchair. He was having a hard time getting people to adjust it enough, and he was developing pressure sores to the point where it was causing him a lot of pain, and he was stuck sitting and he couldn't move, and to have people constantly adjusting him, it just wasn't working. So he did this, and it worked, and he was like, that was so happy. That brought him supreme happiness. And it was truly amazing. It was amazing that he was able to do this. It worked, but gleeful. Every time Hal achieved something that he was excited about, he was so happy.
And you talked about with his hobbies. He liked to go hiking and running up in the woods and up in the hills. And I've always enjoyed that. I grew up in a very mountainous area, so I always I always personally found that kind of going up there, getting out of the town, even though it was a very very tiny town, but getting out of there, and you could kind of get up and you get over like a hill or two, and it's almost like there's nothing else in the world that's around you, and it's very kind of like the Zen running in a way where it focuses your mind. I was wondering if that was something that Hal found, where just kind of getting away out into the to nature was kind of a very regenerative thing for him.
Yes, yes. I exactly. He did enjoy getting out to nature. He enjoyed eh, running. He enjoyed hiking. When we went on road trips with the kids or without the kids, we always wanted to go to natural places, to see a lot of the Bryce, Grand Canyon, things like places like that where he could just enjoy seeing natural sights, hiking.
And as far as this kind of a side question, but I was just wondering what kind of music actually that he enjoyed listening to, whether it was. I mean, people's musical tastes will change throughout their life, but
Yeah.
there's usually a very set things that you really like. Usually, kind of get cemented in your youth. But what kind of music did he enjoy going to? Did he like going to concerts, or was he kind of a more of a homebody in that sense, where he'd just rather listen to it at home?
He did like concerts. We used to go to concerts together. Uh, we we went to college in the 70s, but I'd say that Hal was really big on the 80s new age more so than the music from the 70s. He was never into the uh, psychedelic rock type stuff, but he really liked pre new age and new age music into the 80s. Moving into the 90s, he continued to always be listening to new music. He enjoyed the Killers, for example, things that were upbeat. I'm trying to. We did go to a lot of concerts, but more of the 80s type of stuff, Duran Duran, In Excess, things like that. Not so much the heavy rock 70s. And certainly not the disco 70s, even though, again, we were in college in the 70s, and he listened to things like that. I think some of the 70s brought back memories of drinking in college, so he wasn't really wanting that because he didn't want to, like Doors, music like that was bringing back that. Towards the end of his life, he started listening to uh, country, and I think that was more. He was becoming more nostalgic, and I'm talking when he had ALS now. So all of a sudden he got into country, and that was new. It wasn't that Hal disliked any music. I couldn't really say there was anything that he would say, "Oh, I can't stand this," but he was never a rap person, and he was never really an opera person. He did listen to classical, lot of different things. We didn't go to classical concerts though. We went to concerts where we could move, where we could get up and dance a little bit in the aisles. It was fun. The last one we went to was a Killers concert that was playing locally in Santa Barbara. Hal had ALS at that point, but it was really early. And I remember as we walked through the stadium, he was kind of checking out the handicapped areas and saying, "Well, that's where I'm going to have to go. Oh, that's where I'm going to have to be." And he was very upbeat about it, like, "Well, yeah, we're going to have to figure out how we can keep going to concerts so I can do this." Uh, but we didn't end up really doing too much of that once he was in a wheelchair.
Something that struggle with, as many people do, especially. Well, I think probably this is very historical, but now it's something we can actually work on and figure out. But that's work life balance. And I was just wondering, you kind of had talked about that where Hal shifted things, but what was, his work life balance as far as for being able to make sure that everything got done to provide for the family, but also to be able to give you and the kids the time that they needed as well.
Yeah, I think Hal always did everything that he wanted to do, maybe to the detriment of his own health. But I think the time when when it was most obvious to me was when he was working full time, probably Green Hills, and also working with Phil, because at that point he would be working full days at the office at Green Hills, come home, want to do things like maybe go out for a quick run or something like that. And then Phil would call maybe during dinner time, and Hal would get on the phone, and then he would go over to the computer, and then he would be working, and that could go into the night. And I wasn't even aware of how much time he was putting into those things, but it seemed like he did everything, but he didn't really maybe take care of himself. Maybe the things that got lost during those years were the running and the exercise, and I think those were the years where he put on the weight, uh, because he was just so busy doing things that took up so much time, and he needed to squeeze a little sleep in there too. He was much happier working for PGP, where he didn't have to double work, where he didn't have to do double duty.
Oh, okay. So it seems like it was more of um, that it was family first, and then but then work took precedence over his own self care more than
Yes,
anything.
yes,
And I think that's very very common, especially the some of the programmers that I know. That's very much because imagine later on with PGP, that was more of a time when you could do that from home, so you kind of free up your schedule more versus having to go technically into an office to do a lot of your work where you could do that from home. So that was something that, well, I can do that from 8 o'clock to 2 or 3 in the morning, and then I'll just sleep until the kids get up or whatever.
yeah, right.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the second to last question, I wanted to end talking about your work with the ALS, but the last question I wanted to ask was if there was a specific memory that you can think of and feel like sharing that would best convey to the people who are listening who Hal was as a person and what he meant to you.
Hmm. That's a tough one. Hal, I feel like Hal always assured me that we had a partnership, that we were a partnership. I always felt like I learned so much from him. I came into our marriage a child, and he taught me so much about the big picture and being and looking for good. He always would assure me that he learned a lot from me, or as much or more from me. I'm not sure how. Dustin, would you like me to share a little bit about the end of Hal's life, just so people can understand why I've become so hesitant to be
Yes, of course.
okay? Because this isn't my memory of Hal, but this is more why now I sadly am not as publicly involved in things as I would truly wish to be. Uh, but towards the end of Hal's life, we after Bitcoin became very uh, successful, and there were articles trying to figure out who the inventor of Bitcoin was and whether Hal was Satoshi, we started receiving threats and extortion demands and things like that. And there was a very traumatic incident in May, June of the year that he died, 2014. At that point, Hal was really completely paralyzed and on life support, and he couldn't communicate with his eyes anymore except to say yes, no, and that was even difficult. So he was pretty weak at that point. Uh, but we received a threat that if we didn't send this person who called himself Bitcoin Troll some Bitcoin, that he would we would be sorry, basically. And we this ended up with some SWAT attacks, and Hal was really badly hurt during one of them, where he was we I was out he I was forced to take him outside in the middle of a shower, in the middle of him being off life support. We put him back on life support, but it was physically really hard on him. Uh, and I have all kinds of details about that, but it ended up shortening his life. I know that. So it was a bad time. And since then, I still occasionally receive threats. Unfortunately for us or whatever, I can't really respond to extortion threats with Bitcoin because needed to use we need to convert our Bitcoin in order to keep Hal comfortable. ALS is a very expensive disease. And if you have someone living at home on life support, there are so many costs that are not covered by insurance. So I was very fortunate and grateful to have those Bitcoin to fall back on. I will always be grateful for that. I had support from people, but not enough, not financial support, just more so anyway, I don't want to keep going on with this, but it hasn't stopped. And so I prefer not to be too public because I don't want to respond to I don't want more of these attacks. They've continued, and I found that I've had to minimize my contacts with people. I love the Bitcoin community. I'm so grateful for and it makes me so happy to see people recognizing Hal, but I don't respond because I'm afraid. I'm afraid of the few bad apples out there that are still out there to try to hurt us.
And that's completely understandable, and it's very heartbreaking to hear that people are continue to and during that time where we're just causing more strife where it already was a very trying time for you guys. But since then, though, you've done a lot of work with the ALS Association and the Golden West chapter locally. And if you don't mind, maybe sharing about what you do there, what the ALS Association and Golden West does specifically, and how people can help. Because
Sure,
one of
sure. I would love to do that. So I'm gonna back off a little bit and end with that. So I'm gonna back off to why I do this. Yes, Hal had ALS, and Hal chose to be cryonically preserved at Alcor. And the reason why he did that was because he loved life, and he didn't want to give up on living. And he did admit that he didn't he's not a believer per se in anything. So it's not that in being frozen he believes someday he will come back to life, but he did believe that there was a chance. And I'm committed to helping him in any way achieve that if there is a chance. When Hal died, he had some pretty severe issues with the ALS had progressed to a crazy amount. It had affected his eyes, his brain, all kinds of things. So, and I don't want this to happen to anyone else. And I would love to be able to someday have Hal alive again and healthy. In order for Hal to be alive again and healthy, it's a pipe dream, I know, but we need a cure for ALS. I see people every day in my work being diagnosed with ALS, and we still don't have a cure for it. We still don't have even a way to stop its progression. The the research is happening and things are happening, but we're not there. We're not even close to there. I my work with the ALS, I'm what's called a care management consultant. I meet with people who have been diagnosed with ALS in the Santa Barbara community, and what our association does is we can offer them all kinds of loaner equipment like powered chairs, eye gaze equipment, so that they can have have access to that equipment quickly, because going through insurance can take a long time, and for someone with fast progression, going through insurance, which is what Hal and I often did, it can take multiple months, and by the time you get the okay through your insurance, you're no longer you would no longer benefit from that particular piece of equipment because you've progressed beyond that. It's just slow. In addition, a lot of things aren't covered. So we do get equipment for people. I give people all kinds of help and advice on how to access benefits that they might not know they have. I run a support group where people can meet together and share face to face issues they're dealing with, and same for the caregivers. Our association also works a lot on research, and that's we funds go towards all kinds of research that's happening to work on not only technology to improve quality of life, but cures and ways to stop this disease. So it's a big thing. I like Golden West because it's my local chapter. Initially, when Hal was diagnosed with ALS, the also didn't have much of a presence here in Santa Barbara. Towards the end, a lot more, and since the Ice Bucket Challenge, it's really helped to fund more presence. So yes, they helped us. They were the ones that helped us. I can help more, and they are helping more, and they are being more effective now because of funds that have gone to them. they they've hired. We didn't even have a Santa Barbara person when Hal had ALS. We were part of the greater Los Angeles area, and so yes, we had help, and I really, it did make a difference, but I feel like we can make a lot more of a difference now, and I'm happy that I can help my people here. We're kind of in an isolated area. It doesn't sound isolated, but when it comes to medical support, we're isolated. There is no facility here in Santa Barbara that will take care of people that are on life support that have had a tracheostomy. Hal had to live at home. Most people don't have the support, the kind of person like me and with medical background that makes that possible. I have a few people here in Santa Barbara right now with trachs living at home, but they have to live at home. If they don't live at home, they either have to move to LA, far away from family and friends, or they choose to end their life. So we're working to change that too. A lot of things. My fundraiser, which I'm doing every year, is in May, which is Hal's birthday, and it's a way for me to celebrate Hal instead of just mourning his loss. And it's a bike ride. Hal and I used to go on bike rides every year on our anniversary just to celebrate our marriage together. And every year we would ride at least the number of miles that were the number of years that we had been married. Uh, when he was we were married in 1979. So when he was diagnosed, it was 30 years. When he died, it was 35 years. Uh, the last long ride we went on was that 30-year anniversary, and that was the first year where he couldn't even make the 30 miles. He stopped at around 25, and I said, "Don't worry, Hal. We didn't know he had ALS yet. It was in, and I said, "Don't worry, Hal. Next year we'll do it." But of course, next year we didn't do it. But at any rate, that's why the bike ride is a cool thing for me. This fundraiser, I go ride my bike every year with Hal in my head, in my mind. We raise funds for the ALS Association Golden West chapter. I've got a team called Hal's Pals Fight ALS, which was the name of the team that we created when he was still alive. And anything else, Dustin, about the ALS Association or my fundraiser?
Well, I wanted to end this episode though with the last sentence of Hal's Bitcoin and Me post that he posted in the Bitcoin Talk forum. He said that I am comfortable with my legacy, and we all agree that he has a great one, both personally and professionally. And I wanted to really thank you so much for sharing your story about Hal and yourself with us, and to remind people that do listen to respect your family's privacy, and to reiterate that if you encourage you to go to, I would post the full address to, and I'll have that in the show notes. But I'm just going to be doing a redirect at didyouknowcrypto.com/Hal to the ALS Golden West chapters, the fundraiser to sponsor for the Hal's Pals bike ride. So if you go there, or at on Twitter, if you go to at Bitcoin the number 4 ALS, it'll have all that information. Or if you just want to Google it, that's fine as well. And there's going to be the donation portal where you can donate cash through credit or debit card and sponsor riders. Or if you yourself are in the area and want to run that, that'd be great. And then we're also working on, by the time that this goes live, we'll have that Bitcoin donation address, and that will be going specifically all to the Golden West chapter that took care of Hal, and to honor Hal's memory. And just once again, thank you so much for agreeing to come on.
Oh, you're welcome. It actually makes me happy to talk about these memories of Hal. It just reminds me of how he was a glass mostly full guy, and I'm going to love him forever. Thank you, Dustin.